The road to Killzone 2 was almost certainly a difficult one, fraught with unrealistic expectations defined by an infamous pre-rendered trailer. Yet, despite the odds, developer Guerrilla Games managed to produce one of the most visually striking games of the generation. Even today, Killzone 2 stands head and shoulders above many games released for PlayStation 3 in terms of both technical ambition and artistic vision. Now more than 10 years after its original release, we return to the battlefield for a retrospective on the seminal PlayStation 3 release. On this episode, we'll explore the visual majesty that is Killzone 2 while discussing the history of Guerrilla Games, the infamous pre-rendered teaser trailer, and more. So grab your DualShock and let's lock and load. Halo Combat Evolved. Released in 2001 alongside the original Xbox, this first-person masterpiece forever altered the console space by proving that a dual-analog first-person shooter could work and work well. Going beyond even Rare's seminal GoldenEye for Nintendo 64, Halo delivers near-flawless control mechanics, a remarkable single-player campaign, and multiplayer so good that it helped kick off online multiplayer on the Xbox before the arrival of Xbox Live. And in its wake, much to the chagrin of developers everywhere, the concept of the Halo Killer was born. This is arguably the moment in which the first-person shooter became a central pillar of console gaming, and many a developer scrambled to deliver their own take on the formula. But despite the Halo Killer label thrown around by fans and press alike, this was never the intention of Dutch studio Guerrilla Games when it started the original Killzone project. Killzone was, of course, one of two projects in development for PlayStation 2 at the time, the other being Shellshock NAM 67, a third-person shooter and Guerrilla's only multi-platform release, at least under the Guerrilla name. You see, Guerrilla itself is the result of a merger between smaller Dutch developers, such as Orange Games, who was responsible for Jazz Jackrabbit, published by Epic Games. These developers joined forces under the Lost Boys Games name, the gaming division of the Dutch multimedia corporation Lost Boys. Their history includes some rather bizarre releases, such as The Lost Ride for Philips CDI, an FMV rollercoaster game, and Tiny Toon Adventures, Dizzy's Candy Quest for the Game Boy Color. The Lost Ride is especially fascinating though. Firstly, there's the developer name itself. It was made by Formula Game Development, which was a separate division of Lost Boys Games, generally focused on portable titles, except in this case where they made a game for CDI. It uses the same logo except it's green. The Lost Ride itself then is a full-motion video game centered on a crazy roller coaster with a mounted gun on the top. The twist, it's randomly generated. Yes, basically the game can select from many different FMV sequences to construct its world when you begin the game. At various junctions you can change your direction and, more impressively, the video is warped in a way to allow you to move the camera slightly left or right using the controller. You basically fight enemies while navigating the maze. It's not a great game, mind you, but it's weirdly ambitious for the CDI and is a very, very late release for the system. Now, when the company was sold off and renamed Guerrilla Games in 2003 though, their focus shifted towards more violent, gritty experiences such as Killzone. With lots of pre-release hype behind it, the original Killzone eventually released in 2004 to average reviews, but for those that played it, there was this spark that suggested the potential for something greater. The atmosphere was thick and the visuals rather ambitious for the platform. Animation on weaponry was remarkably robust, and the game even featured multiple playable characters and online multiplayer. Unfortunately, Killzone is ultimately let down by a remarkably choppy frame rate and often poor mission design. Shellshock NAM67 did not exhibit these performance problems, but it was far less inspired and ultimately forgotten. A small footnote in the history of the company, I suppose. But for many, the Killzone name and Guerrilla Games itself only really took center stage at E3 2005 with the reveal of PlayStation 3. This now infamous trailer showcases a level of detail and fidelity unlike anything we could imagine at the time, and for good reason. The trailer was completely pre-rendered, and according to Guerrilla, was never intended to represent the final game. They barely had a single triangle displaying on PS3 dev kits at the time, but thanks to a comment made by a Sony exec at the show, people were led to believe it was real. As a result, this trailer potentially made development of the game even more stressful for the team, with public expectations centered around a piece of media that simply did not represent what could be achieved. And thus, Killzone 2 and Guerrilla Games went underground to work on the game. Then, 2 years later, after this infamous debut, the team returned to center stage. It was E3 2007 and Killzone 2 received its first proper reveal, with a new look at the game running on actual PlayStation 3 hardware. No, it did not match that original pre-rendered trailer, but the team got a lot closer than anyone could have imagined in terms of pulling off the look and feel. In fact, from an artistic point of view, I'd say the team exceeded expectations. Killzone 2 looks tremendously impressive. But even after its long absence from the spotlight, it wouldn't release until nearly 2 years later in early 2009, and only then did we finally have the opportunity to experience the game. And yes, Guerrilla delivered something very special. The date is February 27th, 2009, and after years of anticipation, Killzone 2 is unleashed. The result, a technical showpiece for the PlayStation 3 platform sporting large environments with a focus on post-processing, dynamic lighting, alpha effects, and animation. It was phenomenal. These days, describing something as dark or gritty is typically met with a raised eyebrow, but Killzone 2 really pulls it off. There is this overwhelming sense of dread throughout the game. Thick, billowing clouds fill the skies. Flashes of lightning briefly illuminate the surrounding city streets. Power lines violently whip overhead, and particles float effortlessly through the ash-filled air. As you take control, a carefully designed camera bob simulates movement through the environment, while a strategically applied depth of field is used to accentuate the weapon model. Every motion of your hands is perfectly realized and precisely executed. Every reload is perfection. It looks remarkable in motion, even today. The presentation is complex, and there are a lot of elements here used to create the world of Killzone 2. Lighting, animation, and effects work all work in tandem to create something truly striking. One of the key design goals when creating Killzone 2 then was to deliver realistic and distinctive lighting, enabling a huge number of dynamic lights per scene. To achieve this, the team developed an engine designed to utilize the PlayStation 3 hardware effectively. This means leveraging the SPUs to aid the underpowered RSX whenever possible, while keeping memory requirements reasonable. The SPUs are used for things such as particles, skinning, triangle culling, image-based light generation, and more. When Killzone 2 shipped, deferred rendering in games was still relatively new, and this game highlighted some of the benefits. By utilizing a separate buffer known as the G buffer to store information pertaining to different passes such as depths, normals, albedo, and the like, some new possibilities for rendering are opened. The primary advantage centers on decoupling scene geometry and lighting. Lights are slow when using pure forward rendering, as each light requires an extra pass, thus more processing time. The deferred approach used here allows the artists to pack each area with lots of dynamic lights without a huge performance cost. As a result, these lights are everywhere. Every single enemy and friendly includes individual point lights affixed to their combat attire, while explosions and gunfire produce huge bursts of light all around the battlefield. Lights can be included all over, and it greatly contributes to the unique look and feel of Killzone 2. Of course, deferred rendering does not play nicely with transparency, so for things like smoke particles and fire, a second forward pass is used after the lighting pass. Again, it's a very forward-looking approach. And what I love about the dynamic lights in Killzone 2 is that many of them can cast shadows. No matter where you are in the world, the muzzle flash from your weapon will always cast shadows from both dynamic and static geometry. Same is true for the flashlight available on the shotgun. Muzzle flash shadows are still relatively uncommon in modern games today and would mostly disappear in Killzone 3, so it's nice to see this in a 2009 release. The world, however, relies on a mixed solution for lighting, with static scene geometry utilizing pre-computed light maps. This tried and true method of world lighting works especially well here. The time of day is never dynamic, so artists were able to generate very dramatic scenes. The approach to baked lighting also takes care of ambient occlusion on static objects. This is a game that lacks real-time screen space AO, which was only just starting to appear in console games in 2009, but it doesn't feel flat in the same way as games such as Insomniac's Resistance 2. Which makes for an interesting comparison point, as Resistance 2 is another Sony-published shooter that arrived to market just prior to Killzone 2, and there's this huge contrast between the visuals in both games. Resistance 2, while impressively large in scale, still utilizes very flat lighting and somewhat weightless animation. It just doesn't feel that fluid to play. The third game would hugely improve upon these elements, mind you, but Killzone 2's approach to lighting, animation, and post-effects was a huge leap from games like Resistance 2 at the time. And all of this action is viewed through a very dynamic first-person point of view. Every gunshot is punctuated with a burst of light as the barrel snaps back and shell casings fly off to the side. Every weapon has a remarkably detailed reloading animation, and the level of detail visible across each weapon remains impressive to this day. Actions such as climbing ladders receive detailed first-person animation, while one section even has you commanding a mech across the battlefield, complete with a detailed cockpit that sways and moves realistically as you stomp around the battlefield. Killzone 2 introduces aiming down sights to the series as well, something that had only just started to become popular following games such as Call of Duty 4 and the original Crysis. It's worth noting that aiming down sights did not even appear in the original 2005 pre-rendered CGI trailer. They simply zoomed the camera in a bit while retaining the same viewpoint on the weapon. The animation used for scoping in and out in Killzone 2 looks phenomenal, and the application of depth of field around the weapon further enhances this. The weapon model is also designed to situate itself properly based on proximity to certain surfaces. When using the bespoke cover system, for instance, your character adjusts his rifle based on position in the scene. There are other camera effects used to enhance the overall presentation as well. Lens flares are used in conjunction with bright sources of light, while dirt and debris collect on the camera. Killzone 2 does seem to lack full body awareness, mind you, which would be added in Killzone 3, but it still conveys the sensation of being anchored to the world. And at the very least, your character can still cast shadows across the environment. Speaking of characters, the rest of the cast appear rather detailed for a 2009 first-person shooter, though they don't hold up quite as well as the weapon models. From a 2019 perspective, the main issue lies in the texture work and shading, which are both somewhat behind the times, but it still works well within the artistic design of this game. The smooth animation of friendly and enemy characters adds tremendously to the presentation. Per-object motion blur is used on everything to enhance fluidity. The shutter speed is rather low, but it remains mostly artifact-free. Again, while per-pixel motion blur had been around for a while, most implementations during this era still exhibited plenty of artifacts. Killzone 2's post-processing pipeline is much cleaner overall in terms of the end result. Really though, what makes Killzone 2 look so great in motion goes beyond individual animations and effects. It's the sheer volume of interactive objects in the world and the way they work in conjunction with the combat. As they say, the devil's in the details. If there was ever a game worthy of an animated GIF, it's Killzone 2. There's a lot of fine detail packed into this game, so how about a few examples? These little canisters, when hit, can fly around the room until they explode, for instance. Or these storage containers full of tanks which can be blown apart, causing tanks to spill out onto the scene ready for explosion. Or the way in which objects blow around the scene during the fast-moving train section. How about these filing cabinets? Or this table? Or what about the selective destruction, where a layer of geometry is applied to certain objects that can be blown apart during combat? It's limited, but adds a lot to the experience. There's also these nice sparks and other effects which bounce realistically off surfaces. Same goes for debris, which is generated from shooting at stone, dirt, and other materials. Or how about the superb blood particles used to accentuate every hit with a bullet? There's just so many little things like this throughout the environment that react to the surrounding combat, and it really comes together to create a very cohesive experience. This is further enhanced by the enemy behavior and animation. Inverse kinematics are present for one thing, allowing proper foot placement on sloped surfaces. Enemies react realistically too. They can flee for cover and generally behave in interesting ways. Compared to Call of Duty, where foes would function as pop-up targets most of the time, the Helghast are active and move around during combat. You can also of course shoot off enemy helmets, and the way they react to heavy gunfire is just excellent. There's a real sense of weight to the enemies lacking in many other shooters from this era. There's plenty of other cool visual effects included throughout the game as well. The scanline filter applied to various screens throughout the game is gorgeous, revealing individual RGB elements in each display. There's the reflective mirror at the very start of the game. Or these fake light shafts. This was made prior to things like screen space, crepuscular rays, or true volumetric lighting, which would have been too demanding at this point, I believe, though Naughty Dog did come up with a neat solution for Uncharted 3. Here instead they used simple 2D textures positioned in such a way to give the impression of light streaming through windows. Texture-wise, Killzone 2 may use relatively low resolution textures throughout the game when looking closely, but it does include parallax occlusion maps in many areas throughout the game, such as this. The handling of water is also rather interesting, with certain elements of the reflection seemingly being handled within image space. Notice how this disappears when the reflecting object is occluded from view. Moreover, Killzone 2 runs at a full 720p with 2x MSAA. Sure, it's the quincunx variety of course, but in this case, the slight blur is actually beneficial and helps produce a smoother, more filmic overall image. And speaking of filmic, film grain is heavily used throughout. The whole game is just a poster child for what can be achieved using cinematic post effects. The compositing of the overall scene is really just amazing for its day. Honestly, I could go on and on about aspects of the rendering pipeline. It's just such a rich looking experience, but I think you get the picture by now. It's a huge accomplishment in terms of bringing deferred rendering to the forefront in its use of cinematic special effects and compositing, and in its overall art direction. There's just nothing else quite like it. However, even with visuals this impressive, that original 2005 trailer always sat in the back of people's minds, so we have to do a quick comparison. Now, it's not easy to draw a comparison here due to the wide variation between them. Obviously, the pre-render features much higher geometry, crazy particle density, and more, all the things that you could do with an offline render. Now, the real game could never match this, and Guerrilla never claimed that it could, but it's clear that this trailer weighed heavily on the team, and a lot of work was poured into producing something that still felt comparable. Since it shares none of the technology, the big change you'll notice from the visuals is the shift in art direction. The overall trailer more closely resembles the brighter tones of Killzone 1, and some sections, such as this area beneath the bridge, wind up looking rather awkward even. The darker tone and introduction of bright point lights in the final game is a real improvement, I feel, in terms of art direction. I also prefer the general design of the weaponry and animation. The CGI even has weird rendering glitches in it. In this frame, characters appear behind the transport, in the next frame they're sitting on it. It's very strange for a pre-rendered cinematic. Really, beyond that, there just isn't much reason to compare the two since they really share no technology, but it is interesting to see how Guerrilla approached their real-time renderer in comparison. Then there's the 2007 trailer. This is the point where the game re-emerged, and compared to the final game, I feel that the overall presentation has improved. The lighting appears flatter and the game is hugely desaturated, while things like textures are often of lower resolution. That said, certain sections, such as the smoke trail here, do look somewhat more appealing in the demo, but clearly the game has improved overall from this original demo up through launch. That's not to say everything is quite perfect though. As impressive as the game looks, the frame rate is not always on point. Basically, Killzone 2 targets 30 frames per second and often reaches it. But heavy combat sequences such as this bridge see dips into the upper 20s. There's also an occasional 16 millisecond spike along the frame time graph. But at the same time, we gotta keep in mind that this is the PlayStation 3, and many other shooters from this generation, save for something like Call of Duty, struggled to hit and maintain 30 frames per second. The reality is, last generation games were typically worse on average at holding a stable frame rate when compared to modern consoles like PS4 and Xbox One. I know that seems a little crazy, but it's true. So with that in mind, performance isn't half bad. Thankfully, Killzone 3 is an improvement in this area. So for all the visual talk then, how does Killzone 2 hold up? Well, revisiting the game is an interesting experience. This was a title developed during the height of the Call of Duty craze, where campaigns were often very linear and highly scripted sections. Killzone 2 somehow falls right between something like Call of Duty 4 and, say, Halo. It's not nearly as scripted as Call of Duty, and you have a lot more agency to move around the battlefield during combat, but it lacks the wide open feeling of Halo. That main Halo comparison comes from the fact that the enemies are extremely agile and you can often get up right in their face to attack them. Call of Duty is all about pop-up targets at a distance, Halo is about close quarters combat, and Killzone 2 strikes an interesting balance between the two. It's nowhere near as refined as Halo, but it plays pretty well. Provided you can get over one of its major flaws, the input lag. There is a ton of input latency in this game, perhaps resulting from the deferred rendering setup here, which can often incur a significant penalty in that area. Either way, it doesn't feel responsive to play, and despite the description of the controls being heavy, it can be somewhat of a chore at times. This was addressed fully in Killzone 3, which is very responsive all around, but alas, Killzone 2 is still somewhat sluggish to play. Speaking of Killzone 3, while this goes outside the scope of this episode, I did spend some time playing it for comparison's sake, and it's rather interesting to see the types of changes made between the two. There's a real shift in focus from the heavily post-processed, super dark look of Killzone 2 to something a little brighter. There's more color in the image. The MSAA has been replaced with MLAA, which results in more aliasing and shimmering. Things like muzzle flash shadows are mostly missing here, and more. A lot of the smaller details featured in Killzone 2 have been eliminated in pursuit of a larger game world and more complex mission design. It's an absolutely gorgeous game in its own right, and the team made a lot of positive steps in the right direction, including massively reducing input latency, but it's lacking that certain spark that makes Killzone 2 feel so unique. It's just not quite the same. And it's kind of a shame that Killzone 2 exists solely on PlayStation 3. Early on this generation, many PS3 games received ports to newer machines. A 60 frames per second collection featuring Killzone 2 and 3 for the PS4 would have been an amazing remaster to receive. For now though, Killzone 2 lives only on PlayStation 3, and there it will likely remain. It's not a perfect game, and its initial reveal was somewhat misused by Sony, deceiving fans worldwide, but Guerrilla Games managed to triumph over this and deliver one of the most unique shooters of the generation. I didn't even have a chance to touch on the game's unique multiplayer modes, the servers for which have long been shut down. Killzone 2 is a great package and a game well worth revisiting all these years later. It still looks amazing. But that's all from me for now. I hope you enjoyed this slightly more modern but still rather retro look at Killzone 2. Sure, it's a little different from the usual episodes, but let me know if you did enjoy it, and if so, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and follow me over on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.